Welcome back to SimpleBibleProphecy.com. This is Lesson 4, Daniel's 70 Weeks. My name's Pete, and of course you remember Neb and the Rock. If you don't know Neb and the Rock, you might need to go back to the introduction in the first couple of lessons so you have a better idea of what's going on. It is truly the foundation of Bible prophecy. To give you a quick recap, we know that God gave us the future in the form of an outline. That outline came to us in a dream in Daniel chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had this dream of the statue here. And that statue represents 5 kingdoms. And then there was the rock. That rock represents the kingdom of Christ when it returns to here on earth and rules forever and ever. So we know that we have this major outline given to us in 49 verses. Unfortunately, we can't get a lot of details in 49 verses. So what God does is He gives us details later on all through the Bible. But there is also in that major outline what I call 2 sub-outlines. And the first of that sub-outline starts in Daniel chapter 9. To give you a brief background of what's going on, Israel had just finished 70 years of captivity to the Babylonians. The Medes and the Persians were now in charge, just as Daniel had prophesied. Now Daniel is in the middle of reading in the book of Jeremiah when he sees that Jeremiah actually prophesied that Israel would serve 70 years of captivity. Now Daniel is trying to find out what happens after those 70 years. So he goes to God and he prays to God and he confesses his sins and the sins of his nation. God at that point sends the Archangel Gabriel. Now Gabriel only appears 4 times in the entire Bible. One time he goes to Zacharias to announce the birth of John the Baptist. One time he goes to Mary to announce the conception and birth of Jesus. There was another time when he came to Daniel, and it's written in chapter 8, about the interpretation of a dream of the ram and the goat. Now God is sending Daniel to reveal the future to him. Because Daniel is passionately asking God what happens next after the 70 years. So we're going to go to Daniel 9:23 and 24. And Gabriel says to Daniel, "At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding to the vision. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place." So what does that mean to us in layman's terms, what Gabriel just told Daniel? It all goes back to what I said in a previous lesson. It's restoring the relationship between Him and His people. See, God will bring Israel and Jerusalem back to where He intended them to be, with Him. I want you to notice in verse 24 the key words. The key words are intended to bring and restore relationship. Let's start, because there were 6 items. But note the key words at the beginning of each item. To finish the transgression, to make an end of your sin, to make an atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy place. It's all about restoring the relationship between us and Him. Notice the beginning of the key words. To finish, to make an end, to make atonement, to bring in, to seal up, to anoint. When I first read that scripture, one of the things that came to my mind was, well, how long is 70 weeks? See, back then I really didn't know. Now, after doing some research, I found out that weeks in Hebrew actually means 7. Now, does that mean 7 hours, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or 7 years? See, in our terms today, it would be easy. It would be 7 days, because a week represents 7 days. We're not talking about our time. We're talking about back in Daniel's times, and we're talking about the actual Hebrew. In Hebrew, it just means 7. So we have to do some research and find out what that 7 actually represents. But without going into great detail, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, most prophecy teachers agree that the 7 or the 70 weeks represents 7 years. So we have 70 times 7 years. These are not our years. These are what we call prophetic years. A year is 360 days. All right, so as we look at it, so that's 70 times 7 prophetic years equals 490 prophetic years. So God was telling Daniel that there were 490 years remaining until he restores Israel and Jerusalem back to him. Now I'm going to show you a trick that I use, especially when I'm studying prophecy. I have a Bible that I can write in. And if you don't have one, I suggest you get a Bible that you can write in, especially with all the symbolism that is used, especially in prophecy. So if we go to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, right next to 70 weeks, above it or around it or a line drawn to it, I'll write 490 years. So that when I read my Bible, verse 24, I read 490 years have been decreed for your people. Okay? It makes it so much easier when you put it in today's terms so that you don't have to try and figure it out. You're not changing anything. All you're doing is you're putting it in today's vernacular. All right, so we know that Daniel has been told by Gabriel that you have 490 years left or remaining until God restores his relationship with Israel and Jerusalem. So my next question is, when does that time start? Well, let's go to verse 25. Verse 25 says, "So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress." So we know from verse 25, in layman's terms, the 490 years begins from a decree that will be issued to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. But he goes further on to say, and he breaks down the 490 years into sections. So let's look at that real quick again. So we know that the 490 years begins with the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem from verse 25. But notice he also breaks it down further. He says, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, now Gabriel is breaking up that 70 weeks. So let's break it down and let's keep it simple. So Gabriel says there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. All right, if we look at our chart, all we have to do is we'll say 7 times 7 years. That gives us 49 years. And then we'll have 62 times 7 years, which equals 434 years. Now, to this day, I really don't understand why he broke up the two numbers the way he did. I haven't really found anything prophetically that I agree with or am wholeheartedly about on why he broke them up into 2 sections. But what I do know is this. If you add the 49 years to the 434 years, you come up with 483 years. So again, using my little trick, what I do is out to the side or right above the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, I write 483 years. So it reads, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 483 years. So what does that mean? That means that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, the Messiah will appear 483 years later. So from just this first part of the verse, we know that once the time starts, 483 years later, the Messiah will appear for the nation of Israel. He gives the actual date that the Messiah would appear. Now, this prophecy is in the Old Testament, and the actual word Messiah is only used twice in the entire Old Testament. Both times they're used in Daniel, and both times the word Messiah is used in this chapter. There's no other place in the Old Testament that the word Messiah is ever used. Just a little small tidbit of information I thought you'd like to know. As we look back at the third part of verse 25, it says, "It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress." This is talking about the rebuilding and the restoring of Jerusalem. And it actually turned out that way. They really had a difficult time rebuilding that city. So now we'll move on to verse 26. It says, "Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined." So let's break down verse 26 into layman's terms. So then Gabriel tells Daniel that after the revelation of the Messiah, so after the 483 years, we know that first comes the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. 483 years later, the Messiah will be revealed. Then after the Messiah is revealed, two things are going to happen. The Messiah will be cut off, which means in Hebrew terms, he will be killed. And the temple and Jerusalem will be destroyed. This is the second destruction of the temple. Now, in order for the temple to be destroyed, the temple has to be rebuilt. So we know there will be a second temple. And it will be destroyed. And it will be destroyed by the Antichrist ancestors. So going back to the original 490 years that Gabriel talked about at the very beginning in verse 24, we know that from verse 25 and 26, Gabriel covered 483 years. So we only have 7 years left out of the 490 years. We're going to cover that now in verse 27. So as we look at verse 27, we see, "And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week." There's your 7 years. "But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So now we know that Gabriel has given us a start date. The starting date for the final 7 years of the 490 years, that start date will be a 7-year covenant, or what we might call a treaty in this modern day times. There will be a 7-year treaty with many nations. Obviously, Israel is going to be involved in that, and I believe Israel will be the center of that treaty. All right, so let's look at the second part of verse 27. It says, "But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering." Okay, so if we go back and look at the beginning of verse 27, Gabriel tells Daniel that the time will begin, or the final 7 years will begin with a 7-year treaty with many nations, which Israel will be a part of. Then Gabriel says right after that, he's going to divide that 7 years into 2 parts, because he says midway. So we know we got 3.5 years and 3.5 years. Don't let all the numbers confuse you. I'm going to go back right now, and we're trying to keep it simple. We're going to break it down. So verse 24 says we have 490 years that have been decreed for the people of Israel and Jerusalem. In verse 26, Gabriel comes back and says, all right, now we're going to divide that 490 years up. There are going to be a total of 483 years from the issuing of a decree to rebuild and restore Jerusalem until the Messiah. All right, so that's 483 years minus 490 gives us 7 years. The final 7 years start with a treaty between many nations. And that final 7 years is actually divided up into 2 parts. It's that simple. Okay, I just went through Daniel chapter 9 and basically the last part of it very quickly. Just gave you a quick main glimpse of it. We're going to go into further details in the next lesson. But what I want you to understand is the time. We're trying to get down the time that's in this part of the prophecy, because we really haven't talked about time yet. But in my opinion, Daniel 9 verses 24 through 27 are the 4 most powerful prophetic verses in the Bible. You can't get more powerful than them. They give you 9 major events that are going to happen in the future. I'm going to give you those 9 events right now so that when you go back and read over this, you'll get a better understanding. See, because he tells them that he's going to restore the relationship between him and his people in Jerusalem. He also tells us the day when the Messiah will appear. He tells us that the Messiah will be killed. He tells us that the second temple will be rebuilt. Then he tells us the second temple will be destroyed. Then he tells us the temple will be rebuilt a 3rd time. He also tells us a treaty will be made for 7 years with many nations, and that the Antichrist will be involved in the treaty. He tells us that the Antichrist will proclaim himself to be God in the 3rd temple. And he also tells us that the Antichrist will be defeated. Those are 9 key major events, all packed into 4 verses. Amazing. Well, that was just a quick look into Daniel chapter 9. We're going to get into a lot more details in the next lesson. We're going to discuss some of those prophecies that have already happened, and then we'll discuss some of the prophecies that have yet to happen, and some of them that we're on the verge of right now. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope to see you again. Just remember what Jesus said, because I live, you will also live. Thank you.